Welcome to the latest in a new series of EdSource Roundtables. My name is Ann Vasquez, the Executive Director of EdSource. The role that early education plays in our society is really part of a long-standing national conversation, and never more so today. There's long-awaited changes that are on the horizon. In California, universal transitional kindergarten is on its way to becoming a reality. Today, we're going to explore the impact of early education and how TK, as it's known, serves as a bridge between preschool and kindergarten. I'd like to make sure I thank our supporters and our funders. Without them, it would not be possible to have these types of conversations. So I'd like to thank the Heising-Simons Foundation and the Sobrato Family Foundation for making today's roundtable possible. And now on to the introductions. We have a wonderful panel for you today. Please welcome Vicki Ramos-Harris, who serves as the Director of Educational Equity for Advancement Project California. Patricia Patricia Lozano, I stand corrected, Executive Director of Early Edge California. Deborah Stipek, Emeritus Professor of Education and the former Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. Also joining our discussion today is Samantha Tran, Senior Managing Director of Education Policy at Children Now. And finally, and last but not least, I'd like to introduce our moderator, early education reporter, Karen D'Souza. Welcome, everyone. Karen, I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. I am so excited for this discussion today. We've got like a fantastic panelist. And I think this is such an important discussion to be having about universal transitional kindergarten. I know I'm personally really excited to see how the state will roll this out as an education writer, but also as a mom and one who spent a lot of hours at a TK craft table back in the day. That was several years ago now. As everyone here knows, TK started in 2012, but very shortly, it's going to be gradually growing to accommodate all 4-year-olds in the state. So let's jump in with some questions. Please feel free to holler or just wave if you have something you want to add. California has one of the largest achievement gaps in the country. Some children are way behind before they even enter the door of kindergarten, which can set them up to fail later. So my question to all of you is, can early education remedy this? And why is early education so vital? Samantha, Deborah, Vicki, can you guys start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think the thing that many don't fully appreciate about the California context is that not only do we have among the largest gaps in achievement in the country, every subgroup is kind of behind the curve compared to the rest of the nation. And so what research has demonstrated, though, is that in fact, those gaps begin before a child ever walks through the kindergarten door. And so, you know, there's a real opportunity there. And yet California, you know, when we're ranked against the rest of the nation in terms of the types of opportunities we provide for kids, we're like 33rd in the nation in terms of child well-being. So there's a lot of room for us to improve and grow. And this opportunity around investing in our 4-year-olds and figuring out the supports they need is critical. You know, I know Deborah and others on the call can really speak to, you know, what we've seen from the research that when there's really intentional, thoughtful early learning opportunities, the impact is profound, right? I mean, we reduce the need for special education, higher graduation rates, you know, long-term health outcomes. So there's a real opportunity here and a lot of space for us to need to grow in this space.
I'll just add that I think there's much more attention paid across the country to the early years, in part for two reasons. Two different kinds of research have informed that perspective. One is we know a lot more about brain development now during those early years, and we know that there's tremendous amount of brain development in those first 5 years that is really creating the foundation for all future learning. And that what children experience in those first 5 years actually influences their brain development. So we want to make sure that they are given, that all children are given the best optimal experiences that we can provide for them. The other thing is that there's now ample evidence, as Samantha mentioned, on the long-term effects of early childhood education, particularly preschool. But I just want to emphasize one thing about all of that research, which is that they only find long-term effects if it's quality preschool. And so I think California, while it puts a lot of emphasis on expanding access to early childhood education, we need to put equal attention to making sure that that's high quality.
Before we move on to the next question, and thank you both for that, I apologize. I want to make sure that I introduce someone who's very important on our panel, who is inside the classroom in a transitional kindergarten classroom, Paula Merrigan. Thank you, Paula, for being here.
Hello, Paula. So I just wanted to emphasize Deborah's point about what the critical years are. The first 5 years are such a magical period for learning and for development. This is when children are learning how to learn, how to play, what the world is around them. They're learning their self-identity. They're learning their family culture. They're learning languages. In California, 60% of children 0 to 5 are learning multiple languages, are dual language learners. And so the foundation that we need to make sure is there in those earliest years, this magical period, is really profound. They need language-rich environments. They need the early learning, early math skills, early literacy skills, right? And so I think about, I have a 1.5-year-old, and I have a background in early childhood in terms of advocacy, but my mother-in-law is actually an early childhood educator. And so we read the same books, but she gets so much more out of those learning experiences with my mother-in-law, who has the expertise, right? And so I'm learning from her. And so how families work together with early childhood professionals is really critical in terms of providing those early learning experiences that offer that robust foundation for long-term success in school and in life. And we just know that far too many of our children of color and low-income communities do not have access to those opportunities, to Samantha's point. And so we really are excited about this opportunity, these investments, not just in transitional kindergarten, but the larger early childhood system that was part of the state budget is a critical step forward in terms of really grounding our field and making sure we're providing all of our children with a really strong foundation.
That's a really fascinating point, Vicki. And I wanted to follow up with that. In some ways, I mean, the pandemic has, I think, been hard on all of us and certainly very hard on all the kids. But I wonder if that might not be at least a little bright spot, that it really shined a light on how vital education is, and early childhood education and child care. Which I think, perhaps back in the day, the thinking was childcare was more or less babysitting and not really the understanding that you can play a vital role in engineering and building a child's brain. So maybe we can look to that as a little bright spot. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Absolutely, that's a huge bright spot.
Right. I'll take any bright spot that's out there. Absolutely. Well, that, I mean, that's one of them. At least universal preschool is on the horizon now. We're talking about it, and it's a key element in the Biden agenda. There are, of course, as you guys pointed out, many different paths to universal preschool. TK is just one of them, but let's dig into it. Many teachers describe the program as giving small children the gift of time. Why is that extra year so important to get kids ready for kindergarten? And why even is there the concept of getting ready for kindergarten? I mean, there's the achievement gap that we discussed, but I think a lot of parents, older parents and grandparents certainly, think that school should begin at kindergarten or even in first grade, and really don't have an understanding of why those early years might be so important. Paula, probably there's no better person to ask than you.
And we do, as a TK teacher, we do call it the gift of time, because kindergarten is not what most people experienced when they went to school. What I experienced, what you experienced, what everybody listening experienced is not the kindergarten of today. In kindergarten now, they're expected to count to 100, read a decodable book, give a full comprehensive retell of what happened in that story, write not just words, but full sentences on a topic. And in TK, we don't have those standards. We have lower, more centered towards preschool. We bridge the two, and we can teach in a more developmentally appropriate way. What makes me sad as a teacher is to feel that any child would feel unsuccessful at 5 years old. At 5 years old, you should not feel unsuccessful because you can't write a sentence. But that's the pressure we have on these little kids right now. And TK, we take that pressure off. We give them the chance to learn. We learn through play. We learn through doing. We learn through exploration. And we have the time to do that in TK to build a real solid foundation. I have time to slow my curriculum down. if the kids really need it. I can differentiate my instruction and focus on, if this group can't write their name, we're going to focus on writing our names. But if this group can write their name, then we're going to focus on other skills. And it's just, you have that ability in TK to be really developmentally appropriate and not have to stick with a pacing guide in kindergarten, which it's just, I think our TK kids have a huge advantage over kids who did not get to experience it when they go on to kindergarten.
Absolutely. I know my daughter agrees with you there. She was a TK kid, as I mentioned. And as it turns out, she's ended up being kind of a year older than most of the other kids in her class, which does give her this advantage that she very much enjoys. Deborah, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I loved Paula's description of her program, because it is a description of really good education, of developmentally appropriate education. But I would hope that children in kindergarten get the same developmentally appropriate education. They may be doing somewhat more advanced work, but it still should be adjusted to their levels and understandings and interests and so on. And there should still be time for play. And so I don't see as much of a kind of, there's a year where you prepare and then there's a year where you do school. It's a continuum. And whatever grade children are in, their educational experience should be developmentally appropriate for their understanding and skill level and interest. And all the years before kindergarten are preparation for kindergarten. It's not just that year before, although that year before is particularly important.
Absolutely. Vicki?
Yes, I'd love to just build on Deborah's point. I think it was during the No Child Left Behind era, right, where we started to focus on rigor and we started taking developmental play areas out of kindergarten classrooms and all the things that we know is really important for child development. We started doing that for the sake of rigor. Now, it's not that we want less rigor, but we do want to lead with what is good for kids. What does child development say is critical for their learning? And that's not limited to preschool and TK. It's, as Deborah talked about, kinder and early elementary, and I would argue even higher. So I think this is an opportunity as we think about the pre to third grade continuum and before kinder. How do we push up the culture that really leans into what's good for kids and child development and push up that culture and that approach to education, to Deborah's point, so that it's really about what is helping students to thrive.
Yeah, and I would just build on Vicki's point. I mean, I think there is a movement within the K-12 system to try and be more relationship-based, right? To recognize the social emotional learning, especially coming off the pandemic. And what we know from the research around what high-quality programs look like, it is about the interaction between the adult and the child, right? That's really what defines quality. So it's like, how do we invest in the staff and in that intentionality and in that support? And similar to kind of the theme that we've been talking about, TK is an important space for that, but we do have this broader childcare system. I mean, we have Head Start, which provides a comprehensive wraparound support for kids. We have state preschool. We've got these different programs at play, and so the state really does need to figure out, as we make this commitment to all 4-year-olds, through public school, what is the relationship going to look like with childcare, where we do have some longstanding, infrastructure, though it was pretty badly decimated during the pandemic. I think the last data that we had was that like 10,000 programs serving 300,000 kids went away or were at least temporarily closed, right? So, we've got a challenge on that side. And so as the state is thinking about TK, we have to simultaneously be stepping up on the childcare side so we don't lose the infrastructure, so that we are playing to the Braid research, which says this starts when a child is born. It's not just when they're 4, right? So how do we do both and make sure we're doing it well?
We're getting a lot of great questions from the audience, so thanks to everyone who is participating. I'm going to throw out just 2 quick ones that maybe we can try to address. One, a couple of questions about capacity and just logistically, do our schools have the capacity to house all TK students? And second part to that question is, how long will it take to phase in all the students who would fall under TK?
I think that's why we have the phasing process, where there's going to be 1 year for planning, and then until 2025 and 2026, that's when full implementation. That's the plan. So, there's money for facilities, there's money for recruitment and staffing in the current budget. So LEAs can start planning from now and see, evaluate all the needs they have and use the current funding available to plan for the next 4 or 5 years to get to full implementation, where all 4-year-olds would have access to the TK program.
I think the biggest resource concern right now is staffing, because there will be a shortage of teachers who are prepared to teach transitional kindergarten. And there's a lot of work going on to try to address that shortage.
The budget trailer bill, so SB 130, had funding set aside for infrastructure. I'm going to misquote the number here. I want to say it was about $400 million.
490 million.
Thank you. So I was even more than, okay. So there's the facilities grants available specifically for TK full, I think they're calling it full day K, pre-K, that LEAs need to apply for. Mm-hmm. And one of the, I know someone had a question about the facilities. One of the things in there was for the TKK expansion, they were not, the money could, at some points it said school districts and sometimes it said county office of education about the disbursement of the money, but the money from school districts could not be used for portables. So I think they're looking at like a permanent structure, like not just new facilities, but altering existing facilities so you can make them appropriate for our little 4-year-old students.
Yeah, and I would just jump in on the teacher shortage issue. This is a massive expansion. We're basically talking about a new grade in public education. And so at full implementation, depending on how we think about the ratios, because that's still a little bit up in the air, we're going to need to recruit and retain and train 10,000 to 12,000 new teachers, and between, I think it was on about 16,000 assistant teachers, right? That's a huge scale. In terms of recruitment. And we're already in a teacher shortage, right? I mean, we were in a teacher shortage before the pandemic. The pandemic has made it worse. There are shortage areas like in science and math and special education and bilingual education. And so what we see when those shortages play out is that it's the students who are in most need of support. So our low-income students, our English learners, our foster youth, who are the least likely to get the more seasoned teachers or experienced teachers, just how the flow of it happens across the district and within districts. And so, I think, and I know many agree that this is a space we're going to have to be super intentional about equity when we're training teachers, when we're trying to incentivize them and supporting them to go in high need areas. And right now, the way the rollout is structured, it's by birthday. So we're not focusing on the kids who currently don't have access to preschool or TK. We're basically saying each year we're going to allow a few more months of 4-year-olds to come into the mix. And that doesn't necessarily set us up well to making sure that the highest need kids get the most support. So at the local level, and I think at the state level, we're going to have to think about the right types of infrastructure to address that.
That's a fascinating point, Samantha. As I understand it, I think the rollout is, in some ways, it would be easier because you have the oldest 4s and the almost oldest, and you're working your way to the youngest 4s, which I know is a concern. Paula, correct me if I'm wrong, that the older the child is, it's probably the easiest to integrate them into the classroom.
Yes, it is. And we've seen that with currently TK can have what they call ETK, early TK, where you can have students who didn't qualify under the September 2nd to December 2nd birth date range, but they can come into your TK classroom. So a lot of TK programs have really, they're not just September 2nd to December 2nd birth dates, they have very young 4-year-olds. And there's definitely a difference. I mean, when you look at that continuum of that 48 to 60 months, it's a huge difference in the ability of a child who's 48 months versus 60. So it's definitely easier to, for lack of a better word, to work with the child who's almost 5 because they've been alive longer. They understand things more.
Indeed. And actually that gets to 2 things I want to talk about. One of the reasons the staffing shortage is so crucial is because these littler kids absolutely need the extra staffing, right? They need the extra adults in the room. I know I'm going back to that craft table I've mentioned. I actually had a little girl cut herself twice with the scissors that you're not supposed to be able to cut yourself with. So I literally had to have her right next to me the whole year. Otherwise, she'd be bleeding all over the carpet, and it was obviously my fault. But we need the extra adults. How are we going to find the staffing, given the shortages all throughout the system? What are the pathways going to be? What are the training opportunities? Deborah, maybe you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are concerned about this. There are things happening every day that it's hard to keep up with, but I was on a webinar this morning, or I was listening to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing meeting this morning, and they are looking at a proposal that would help support people who are currently have a permit to teach preschool to be able to get not the full multiple credential, elementary credential that is currently required for TK, but to get a kind of bridge credential that would allow them to take advantage of the experience they've had with little kids to teach TK. There are also apprenticeship and intern programs that are being looked at. There's a lot of funding in the legislation to support people to get the credential that they need, including that it even includes, in addition to tuition and books, childcare if they have children. So there are efforts being made. Whether or not they'll be as successful as we need them to be, I think time will tell, but there's a lot of experimentation going and a lot of, I think, innovative thinking about how to make sure that the classrooms are staffed. One of the concerns, though, that many of us have is that to the degree that people who are currently teaching preschool have a relatively easy pathway to teaching TK, we're going to exacerbate the shortage that we have at preschool. So I think we need to think much more broadly about the issue of people who are taking care of our youngest children and make sure that they're paid appropriately and get the kind of benefits that you get in other jobs so that we can actually attract people into the field. It's because moving them around from one place to another is not going to address the larger problem.
Indeed, that will not address the shortage or the equity issue, which is something I'd like to throw out to everyone. Sam, I know you mentioned that earlier. I mean, the early childhood workforce is primarily women of color, often those of whom working for poverty wages. Why is that the system right now, and how can we fix it?
Well, it's something the state needs to step up and prioritize so that it's not the thing that we're allowing to continue. I mean, we saw studies that looked at the existing workforce in the childcare field, and 60% of them needed to leverage public assistance because they literally are poverty wages. And it's no wonder why there's this strong, turnover within the system. And so, how do we make sure we're investing? And I know there are many policymakers and advocates who are very focused on this issue, trying to reform the finance system to invest more, to ultimately get to compensation, that we actually set up real career pathways and training and support, and that we make a commitment to actually do it as a state. It's not insurmountable. It's a lot about public will and the willingness to invest. I know Vicki and others may have some thoughts on this as well.
Patricia?
Yeah, I see this moment as an opportunity to really make a case for giving opportunities to all EC educators to have pathways and validate their experience. And, we see models like in San Diego that they're co-teaching and using both sides, like the great experience that EC educators have with the TK teacher in the classroom. And I think that now we're in transition. This is a great time for all come together and think about, there's money in the budget, there is this promising program, and how do we really lift up the field and provide opportunities for pathways and for higher compensation for our workforce.
I really appreciate you leading with, Karen, the fact that this is an incredibly diverse workforce. That is a gift. We're an incredibly diverse state, and the fact that our early childhood workforce reflects our diverse population of our children is really important in terms of learning and connections with children and families. And so, yes, step one is recognizing that we have undervalued and underpaid this workforce for a really long time. and that we have an opportunity right now to do different, to do better. The pandemic really showed that the early childhood field is the essential worker of the essential workers of the community, of the economy. And so we now have more clarity than ever before. And we also have resources like we've never had before for a really terrible reason, the pandemic. But how do we use this moment to bring, to address these issues? And so TK and the investments in early childhood beyond TK are a really important first step. And I know that we've been slowly, investing every year, but this was a really big year for incredible investments. And so this is momentum we need to build on. It is not just about TK, it is about the full, birth to third grade continuum, and how we use this moment to lift all boats to create multiple pathways that are flexible and creative and innovative, as Deborah was talking about. Right now, we've been calling and interviewing early childhood educators to just understand their experiences as the pandemic continues to evolve. Those phone calls have to happen at like 9 o'clock at night because they're putting families first. And so if we need to schedule 9 p.m. interviews, what do we need to do to support their learning and these pathways, right? So really thinking, that means we need to hear from them about what those systems of support are that are job embedded, that are compensated. What are the counseling support they need? What are the culturally and linguistically responsive supports and practices on these pathways? And these pathways need to be, yes, to support and build our TK workforce, but also for those who choose to stay in the 0 to 3 workforce, we need strong educators there too who want to stay, who are thriving and compensated and are able to really bring the early childhood experiences that our kids need. So an opportunity to lift all boats. I know leaders want to do that. We have resources now that we can, and hopefully more coming with the federal dollars we hope will come, right? So the opportunity to come together and really raise the early childhood field overall, that's the moment we're in. And so how do we work together to do that?
That's such a great point. And you know what, I wonder, Paula, you mentioned raising quality earlier. I wonder if that wouldn't have a simultaneous effect if we value the caregivers and the preschool teachers more, if that wouldn't help raise quality as well from the student's perspective.
Yeah, whenever we've talked to our early childhood educators, often they feel like there's a lack of respect for what they do. And our early childhood educators, our daycare providers, are taking care of the most important thing to a family, their child. And they need to be honored in that position. They need to be paid a livable wage and not be living on assistance, because as you were saying, they can't even afford to feed their own children because they're living on a substandard wage. I mean, we need to honor the people that are taking care of our children.
Well, I think we need to think about the effects on the children they're taking care of as well. So people who are financially stressed, we know that sort of the mental anxiety that goes along with that, depression and so on, that it's very difficult to be at your best with young children when you're worried about whether you're going to feed your own children at the end of the day. So I think, and the turnover, it's one of the reasons why we have such high turnover. So we're not just concerned about staff for the sake of staff, but we need to be concerned about staff and supporting them for the sake of the children that they're caring for.
Deborah, I did want to
means,
follow up. Sorry about that.
Just really quickly. Oh.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and I think that means in very tangible ways at the local level, when districts are doing this planning work around TK, that they are actively and consistently engaging the Head Start providers, the child care community, families, parents in the planning work in real time, so that there is better coordination, that we're making sure that kids are getting access to the programs that are going to best serve their needs and the family's needs, and that we're mindful of this dynamic between TK and child care on the finance side, right, for providers and for districts. And then at the same time, at the state level,
that we're doing everything we can, including policymakers, really stepping up and saying, yes, we're gonna fund TK, we're gonna fund it at the level that's appropriate, and we're going to also invest in childcare by increasing rates, by creating career pathways. I mean, these are it's hard work, but it's good work, and it's work we can do. So we shouldn't shy away from it. And I think there's responsibility at the local and state level to get that done.
Thank you for outlining the challenges, all of you. I think we're getting a lot of questions in the audience about the role of the credentials and what does that mean for this pipeline of teachers who already have their challenges. And I know it's still being worked out. What do you think the credentialing requirements will do to the pipeline? What's important? What are things to consider? Obviously, implementation is the key here.
Well, right now, to teach TK, you need to have a multiple credential, which basically covers elementary school, although it covers also middle school. So it covers grades TK through 8 right now. Many of us are concerned that the multiple credential is not sufficient to prepare you to teach 4-year-olds, because if you're being prepared to teach 4 to 12, 13-year-olds, how much attention in 1 year can be given to little kids? And they're very different from bigger kids, not just in size, but in the way they learn and their needs for play and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of conversation about creating something like a P3 credential, or a credential that focuses on young children. Now that's a long-term potential solution to ensuring that you have a workforce that is really well prepared to address the needs of children who are younger. It's not going to happen, and it's not going to meet the staffing needs that we have in the next year or two. So this is what the Commission on Teacher Credentialing is trying to do, is to come up with some bridge strategies to allow people to get what we think is the absolute necessary for being prepared to teach TK, but not necessarily the P3 credential, which doesn't even exist now, or the multiple subject credential, which exists, but much of which is not really as useful for teaching 4-year-olds.
And then can I add on to what Ms. Stubbick was saying? It's also, if you have your multiple subject credential and you're teaching TK, you also need to have 24 ECE units, so early childhood education units, to teach TK, because they do realize there is a difference, definitely, between what you're taught in a credential program and then the early childhood. So they require 24 units. So right now, if the existing force wanted to say switch from teaching 2nd grade or kindergarten and come down to TK in the next few years, you can do that, and the state gives you time to obtain those 24 units, and they also have a program that pays for it to get your units, because they realize it is an extra burden. We're asking you to teach a class, and you're going to need these extra units in order to teach that particular grade.
It is, although the legislation also allows districts to essentially, I don't want to say circumvent it, but use their own strategy for approving previous experience or coursework or whatever. So, and I think we probably need something a little bit clearer than just an extra 24 units, which is also a disincentive. So if you're a 2nd grade teacher, you're going to take 24 units in addition to the multiple credential to get paid the same that you got paid as a 2nd grade teacher. I don't know how well that's going to actually work, although it exists.
I also think that we're going to have a conversation in this budget year and moving forward about the assistant teacher qualifications, because right now it says an adult, which means an 18-year-old without a criminal record, to help with the ratios. And I think we would, at least all the folks on this panel would agree that there is a real skill set and knowledge base and training and support that's necessary. So how do we build up the capacity on that front, and then actually make sure that we're paying a wage that is comparable to other professionals who are playing those roles, right? I think there's going to be a lot of debate and a need to make sure that those investments are appropriate, and that we're looking at those qualifications carefully and recruiting and supporting people.
And the last thing I'll add is, yes, we have a lot of work to do to figure out the specifics and the bridges at the teacher level, the teachers who are within the K-12 system right now, and those who are in the early childhood system that are maybe interested in the TK path. And so it's important that there were investments in this budget to support the professional development pathways, but it'll continue to be important to design implementation, design support systems so that these educators, whether they're in K-12 or early childhood in particular, have the support they need to actually to benefit from those pathways. So being creative about what those programs look like and the support resources that they need to actually access them.
Paula, I wanted to ask you, if I remember correctly, I believe you are alone in your classroom largely. How do you do that? What are the challenges? I remember you telling me if you don't have a parent volunteer, you don't have art. You have to make some really tough choices.
It's really challenging, and especially since the pandemic, because in years past, I was able to have parent volunteers come in, and my parent volunteers would run an art center. They would help me out with a math activity. I could utilize them to help me do things that were really engaging with kids, but without making the parents feel some academic pressure. Like, what if I don't know how to do that? It's like, that's okay, you're going to do this. And they loved it. The moms, dads, grandmas, nannies, who you name it, I've had them in here, and it's been a wonderful experience for them and the children. Now with the pandemic, we can't have parent volunteers. So it's extremely challenging. I've had up to 26 children in my TK class with just me. And I know of other teachers who've had up to 30 with no instructional assistant. This year, they were able to give me an instructional assistant to help me out during my literacy block, which is tremendous help because I've never had that. And in all my years of teaching, I've never had help before at that level. And it's the most amazing thing because like you were saying, when it comes to it can't be just any able-bodied 18-year-old. It has to be someone who knows how to work with children and how to encourage them without getting too frustrated when they don't want to do something because they're 4. Like how to work with them and encourage them to keep going. And it makes all the difference in the world this year to have my TK class, even if it's just for an hour, that extra support. And to be able to have someone all my entire teaching day, oh my gosh, the things I could do. I mean, it would make it less stressful because it's a stressful job teaching. You know, when you're in charge of 25, 26, 34-year-olds by yourself, you go home exhausted. Absolutely. I need a nap. I need nap time.
You deserve nap time, Paula.
I don't get it.
And you said something, you said literacy. I cannot imagine trying to teach 26 children to read on my own simultaneously. Why is individualized instruction so important in the early grades?
You know, they develop so differently. I mean, we have the expectations, but they develop differently. Not every child comes in at the same level with the fine motor skills, and you've got to work with them to get them there. Same thing when it comes to, you know, phonemic awareness. Some kids come in and they understand the concepts of letters and sounds and that sound symbol correspondence, and others have no idea. Some, you know, we have a lot of kids that are English learners. And so you've got to give them the extra support too with the vocabulary. I mean, honestly, in TK, a lot of them need support with vocabulary because they don't know a lot of vocabulary. So it all builds together. But I totally just lost track. See, I've been teaching all day and I lost my train of thought.
Well, building on your thought, it's totally understandable. But building on the thought about individualized learning. That's an important notion, and a lot of people in our audience are asking questions about, well, what is developmentally appropriate, and how do you manage to really give that individualized attention to these young children?
We tend to break them up a lot into small groups because I may have an entire group of kids who don't know how to form the letters of their name, and I can really focus with those kids on that skill. While this other group of 5 knows how to do that, I can focus on a different skill with them. So it's really meeting the kids where they're at and having different expectations for different groups based on what they can do right then and where you need to take them. You have to be able to work with them in ways that help them learn. Like I said, it's same with what I was saying about, I don't want them to ever feel like they're a failure. You know, we're going to do our best. That's our, when they say, I can't do it, I say, there's no I can'ts in here. We're going to do our best. That's all I want. Do your best. And for some kids, skills are easier. For some kids, skills are harder. You meet them where they're at and you work with them to get them where you want them to go. That's what differentiation is all about, just working with them where they're at and not expecting everybody to come in knowing a certain level and being able to do a certain thing or stay on task. Therefore, and well, we're still in the pandemic. Most of them didn't go to preschool. Most of them didn't go to daycare. So they're all learning how to socialize amongst other children this year. And that has its own challenges. So
Indeed.
just meeting them where they're at.
There as well this year, probably, right? For a lot of kids, you have to be there for them emotionally.
So yeah, that differentiation and being able to meet them where they're at and bring them where you want them is so key. Having that support in the classroom helps you a lot more to get to that goal.
You mentioned something earlier that I'd like to piggyback on about rigor. What do we think in general? Obviously, I mean, everyone wants to see the kids advance as quickly and as thoroughly as they can. But are there concerns that there's too much rigor required at an early age? I mean, not TK, but by K. I know when my daughter was in K, there was a girl who was at risk of retention, and I thought, gosh, how do you fail kindergarten? That's not something I thought could happen. What do you guys think about that?
Rigor is basically the next step. Wherever children are on that continuum of learning, whether it's the sort of their math trajectory or their literacy trajectory or developing social skills, what's rigorous for them is a little bit beyond where they are. And so I think I loved the way Paula described her classroom and the need for differentiated instruction, because that's optimal learning opportunities for children. In fact, I want my grandson to go to Paula's classroom because she sounds like a really, really good teacher.
Let's move to her district.
Yeah, exactly. But people often think of rigor as being particular kinds of learning. But if you already know that stuff, there are kids who go into kindergarten who already have pretty much mastered the kindergarten curriculum. So it may seem rigorous to some of us or to some kids, but it's really boring and easy for others. So we really need to think of rigor in terms of the individual child, which is why individualized instruction is so hard. It's so important, but it also is incredibly difficult. It's why we need people who are extremely well trained and supported in doing it, because not only do you have to understand exactly what children know and understand, then you need to know what you need to do to get them to the next step in multiple disciplines. And at the same time, you need to manage a classroom of 26 kids, 4-year-olds, who are still developing a lot of self-control and that sort of thing. So it's a tough job, which is why we pay them so much. That was a joke.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, Paula, since I met her the first time, I was like, you're my hero. I mean, seriously, to have to be by yourself in the classroom. And we went and toured classrooms in Boston where they were like, what? You're by yourself? It's like, how is that even possible? So anyhow, like, thank you for doing what you do. And I do, I was a preschool teacher, and it is so key to understand where each child is, right? And I again, when Paula said it, that's like really what developmentally appropriate is, right? And that's why all the training on child development and understanding that is just not one thing that applies to all, but learning how to really follow where the child is and really be able to having that other adult in the classroom to help you and have those small groups and small instructions, because it is so diverse. So I just wanted to add to that, and thank you, Paula, for everything you do.
I'm now jealous that I haven't been able to go to Paula's classroom. So once it's safe and able to go visit, would love to do that. And you really underscore, right, the need for, and why it's so exciting that the ratios changes to TK are so important. Having classrooms with more educators and a 1 to 12, a 1 to 10 in the future, and hopefully, especially in communities with highest needs, like even 1 to 8, like we see in state preschool. for that personalized learning. And, you know, you talked about, Deborah, like the skills that teachers need to really make those connections. And one of the things that we're also really excited about is the opportunity to upgrade the preschool learning foundations, right? Because that's the guidance around what teachers need to be focused on. We know that it's time, right? It's a good time. And it's also a good time to upgrade those to reflect the science around early childhood, as well as what it means to support the diverse students of California, culturally and linguistically responsive practice. Those are specific skills that our educators need. And so the opportunity to upgrade those in our learning foundations and make sure that in our professional pathways that we're providing those supports and resources, so that personalized learning that children are getting are also things that they can make sure to be connected with, that is building on their home language if they're dual language learners as they're building their English and things like that. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity as we think about the future. And so working together to get it right for kids and get it right for our educators.
Absolutely. That's a really, that actually makes me realize I'd like to ask all of you, what is optimal in terms of ratio? What is the ratio you would see and say, perfect, we've got it? Also, in terms of play and curriculum, why is play-based so important?
I think the optimal ratio depends a lot on the skills of the teachers. So I observed many French preschool teachers with large groups of kids. They have 3 or 4 years of specific training in managing and addressing the educational needs of young children. They were masterful. Now I'm not recommending that, but you know, and I know when I had Stanford students going out tutoring small groups of 3 children, Stanford students are great, but we had to reduce the number to 2 or 1 because they had a lot of difficulty managing them. So there's a trade-off there, and they're related. On play-based learning, there are so many interpretations and meanings to play-based learning that I think I'm almost wanting to get rid of the term because I don't know what it means anymore. I've been to programs where they do academics, the kids are sitting at desks and they get 30 minutes a day of free play and they call themselves play-based. Well, I don't consider that play-based. I've also been to programs where children basically have free play the entire time and the teacher is responsive and interacts with them, but all of it is child-initiated activity. Those kids are not going to develop some of the basic skills that we want them to develop. So I think what I prefer to talk about is playful learning, which means that children are learning early math skills. They're learning some language and early literacy skills to, for example, for a 4-year-old to identify letters and letter sound relationships and that sort of thing. But they're doing it in a playful way so they don't feel like they're doing something they have to. The instruction is provided in a sort of game-like context so that it's playful for kids. But play-based, I don't know what that phrase means. And I think if you ask 10 people, you get 10 different sort of descriptions of what it looks like.
Patricia, did I see your hand?
Yeah. And I would just add that I agree with defining play-based is more about the quality of the interactions between the adult and the child, right? It's like, how do we really provide the tools for adults in the classroom to know how to interact with little kids, right? And really know what they need and at the different ages, right? Working with 2-year-olds is very different than 3 and 4 and 5, right? So I think the importance of supporting the adult in the classroom, providing all the tools so they know and can have the resources to provide those warmth and rich interactions. I think it's the key piece.
So if I can add, so yes, Deborah, I love it. Playful learning. I would also add joyful learning, right? Like, we don't want quiet classrooms. That's a big sign that not great learning is happening. We want joyful, playful learning. And understanding what that means, making sure our early childhood educators, our TK educators have that foundation, but also making sure the administrators that support them understand what that means too. I remember in the early days of TK, there was a principal who walked into the classroom and said, "Oh, they're playing, I'll come back. Tell me when the learning's happening and I'll come back." And the teacher was like, "The learning is happening right now." And so making sure that our principals or administrators, we can't just, we have to, absolutely make sure we're focusing on what our educators need, but the administrators can always support them if they have that background in early childhood too. So this is an opportunity, again, to look at what those requirements are, what is needed for our little ones, and making sure everyone who supports their learning is prepared to do that, including our administrators. And that also means making sure that as districts are planning their implementation, that you have the early, as I think it was Samantha who talked about earlier, having those early childhood educators and partners at the table, right? So in districts, making sure that the early childhood leadership at the district is at the table, really guiding that process and opening up the doors to the early child community outside the district about how we can work hand in hand to move this, again, beyond TK, with the larger early childhood access that we need to make sure more of our kids have, and hold hands together and figure out how we make sure more of our kids get served, and leading with the lens of racial equity, economic justice, and diversity and inclusion.
Sam?
Yeah, and building on Vicky's point, I mean, I think what's important for everyone in the field to know is that this planning is happening right now with districts. And, I think districts have built a little bit of stakeholder muscle and engagement through LCFS, right? But there's always room to improve and grow. I think that while there's this year of planning, it doesn't necessarily specify that childcare folks or Head Start folks are at the table. I think that there has to be this real effort made with the districts reaching out. And if districts don't know who their childcare folks are in their community, contact their resource and referral network, get a list of, who are serving our kids so that you can start making contacts. And vice versa, if there are childcare providers that are concerned about the dynamics, or how are we going to make sure that we are providing effective wraparound care, since there's a lot of questions around that. How are we going to ensure that, for example, kids who are eligible for Head Start, which is a comprehensive 2-generational strategy, maybe we have them in Head Start instead of TK, if that's more appropriate for them developmentally. Like, how do we have those conversations and create very intentional plans? And that work is happening, right now. So I'd really encourage at the local level for those connections to be made, and to make sure that the planning process is very thoughtful on that front.
That's such a great point. Absolutely. I mean, I think parents certainly all of us would agree. It's a continuum of care. Your preschool experience, your childcare experience is going to vastly impact, your 1 through 8 experience. We have had such a robust discussion. We're getting tight on time. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but let me ask you this, something that came through the chat, a national question. The Biden reconciliation bill is sort of before Congress right now. There's a lot in there that would speak to the issues we're discussing: universal preschool and more affordable childcare. What are your hopes for that bill? And then also, what do you think will actually occur? And how might it inform California's experience?
Yeah, I have lots of hopes and dreams. It's like, wow, that's a big question. There's so many things I hope for California. I mean, I am really thrilled that the Biden administration is prioritizing this, that we're talking about trying to make sure childcare is invested in and affordable for families, and that, we're moving towards expanded access. So, we're putting a lot of hope and energy on that front. At the same time, I guess the thing that I would channel is that doesn't get California off the hook. Like as a state, we have a responsibility to map a path forward and to figure out how we're going to resource it. And then let's bring in the federal resources on top, because we got a lot of kids and most of them aren't being served. I mean, the last time we had data on infants and toddlers, only like 13% of those who were eligible, who we said, you were eligible because we know you have need, only 13% of them had access, right? That's abysmal. And so, I think, yes, let's look to the federal government to provide the support that can really, take it over the top, but let's also not just look to that horizon. Let's look to ourselves to figure out how we're going to invest.
This state is so unique and so vast. We probably do have to come up with our own authentic solutions.
Yeah, so I think, yes, I think Samantha's right on point. And I think right now, typically in early childhood, we have, like, there's a scarcity issue, right? It's always about the incremental change that we need and like, what is the most important crisis that we need to address this year and that kind of thing. And it makes it hard to have long-term holistic infrastructure discussions, right? And so my hope is that yes, you're right, Samantha, California is not off the hook. This money is like a booster for us to be able to think big time, think long-term, and put those foundations in place so that when those federal resources go away, we have what we need to be on the track that we want for our babies and for our early childhood workforce. And so that's my hope, is that this is the booster that we need to do the things that we wish, we always say, if only we could, if we had the money, now's the time where how do we just really maximize this moment to do the transformation that we've been wanting for a really long time, and make that a reality.
As the governor is fond of saying, let's meet this moment, right? Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all of you, from all of us, on behalf of everybody at EdSource, thank all the panelists for your time and your insight. I know you're all incredibly busy, and some of you have to scuttle off to other panels probably right away. So thank you again, everyone. It's been fantastic. Obviously, we have to do this again because we have a lot to talk about, and I think there are actually hundreds of questions on the chat that we haven't gotten to. So can I get a rock solid contractual agreement from all of you to do this again, perhaps a little closer to the implementation of TK? Great. Thank you again.
Thank you.